In the crowded heart of 19th century Glasgow, where fog from factory chimneys clung stubbornly to the stone buildings and narrow streets echoed with the sound of weary footsteps, a child named Thomas Lipton came into the world. The city was already heaving under the weight of industrial change, and families who arrived chasing hope often discovered only hardship. Among them were his parents, Irish migrants who had crossed the sea, believing Scotland would offer steadier wages and a chance to build a humble future. What they found instead was a city struggling to absorb waves of newcomers, each one competing for the same scarce jobs, the same cramped rooms, the same handful of chances. The Liptons lived the way many in their position did, inside damp tenements where cold seeped through the walls, and several families shared the same narrow staircase. In those small rented rooms, privacy was rare and comfort nearly impossible. Nights were often long and bitter, especially when coal ran low and no extra coins remained to buy more. When work disappeared, as it frequently did, they depended on kind neighbours who lent a loaf of bread, a handful of potatoes, or enough coal to keep the fire burning for a few more hours. Young Thomas watched all of this quietly. He understood the fragility of survival long before he was old enough to put such things into words. Hunger and uncertainty were not distant ideas. They were the familiar background of his earliest memories. Even as a child, he tried to lighten the burden he saw on his parents' faces. He took on whatever odd jobs the streets offered, carrying bundles for shopkeepers, brushing floors, or selling small trinkets to passers-by. Through these early errands, he learned something valuable about people, how they made choices, what they hesitated over, what pleased them, and what frustrated them. He noticed how mothers counted coins twice before spending them, how workers waited for the lowest price, and how a merchant's honesty mattered just as much as the goods on his shelves. Without realizing it, he was studying human nature and the mechanics of trade at the same time. These experiences formed the foundation of his thinking. He came to understand that most working families did not dream of luxuries. They simply wanted trustworthy food, fair prices, and a shop where they would not feel ashamed for having little to spend. By the time he approached adulthood, he had already grasped truths that many older businessmen ignored. Yet life at home remained a relentless struggle. His parents were exhausted, debts hovered constantly, and fresh opportunities never appeared no matter how hard they searched. When Thomas was around 19, he faced a choice that frightened many young men, but tempted him increasingly: to leave everything familiar behind and cross the Atlantic. America, to him, symbolized a kind of open door, not a guarantee, but a possibility, with barely enough money to survive. The voyage, a small bundle of clothes and a stubborn hope that life could change, he boarded a ship heading west. It was a decision born from desperation and ambition at the same time. When he reached the United States, he found a country overflowing with movement and noise. Streets bustled with travelers, traders, and laborers from every corner of the world. The pace was overwhelming, yet energizing. He worked wherever he was accepted, on farms, in fields, and on plantations where single crops stretched across the horizon. Watching how large agricultural operations functioned gave him an understanding of supply, harvest timings, and the long chain that carried goods from soil to shop. He saw how crops were cut, processed, packed, and shipped, and every step of the process fascinated him. When he later shifted to working in American grocery shops, he encountered a world he had never seen in Britain. These stores were clean, bright, and carefully arranged. Goods were stacked neatly, signs were clear, and customers were encouraged to walk through the aisles rather than hurry in and out. Everything was presented with intention: colours, placement, lighting, and smell. Even the smallest details had the power to influence a shopper's decision. Thomas absorbed this like a student studying his craft. He noticed that a tidy store made people feel welcome, that a well-placed display could increase sales, and that treating customers kindly brought them back again. These years in America changed something inside him. They sharpened his instincts, strengthened his confidence, and showed him that simple improvements, done consistently, could make a business more memorable than its competition. He began to imagine what he might accomplish if he returned home with this knowledge. After several years abroad, he saved enough to make the journey back to Scotland, this time not as a boy with empty pockets, but as a young man with a clear sense of what he wanted to create. When he stepped once more onto the familiar streets of Glasgow, he carried far more than his small savings. He brought experience, discipline, and the determination to build a shop that would stand apart from the ones he had known as a child. With the little money he had, he opened a modest grocery store. It was not impressive in size, but it looked different from its neighbours. He arranged goods in neat, thoughtful lines, scrubbed the windows until they shone, and hung signs that were bright enough to catch attention, yet simple enough not to overwhelm. Inside, the shelves were tidy, the counters clean, and the aroma of fresh goods filled the room. Customers noticed immediately. Families who had always rushed through other shops found themselves lingering in his. They were greeted warmly rather than judged. Prices were written clearly, with honesty instead of confusion. Goods were fresh, handled with care, and displayed in ways that made them tempting even to those with few coins to spare. Word spread through the surrounding streets, first quietly and then quickly. Within a short period, Thomas's shop became a familiar, trusted place for working families. As his business grew, he did something few merchants of his era had attempted. He treated his shop not just as a business, but as a brand. He used bold advertisements, organised public events, and designed signs that people would remember. He understood that if people recognised his name, they would trust it. That simple insight became the driving force behind his expansion. More shops opened, each one built on the same foundation: fair prices, clean displays, fresh goods, and friendly service. But he was not satisfied with imitation or slow progress. He searched for ways to lower costs without lowering quality, and that led him to a realization that would change everything. Middlemen created unnecessary expense. If he could buy directly from producers, he could offer better prices than anyone else. That strategy became the core of his business model and the secret behind the rapid rise of his stores. As Thomas's influence spread across Glasgow, he found himself standing at the edge of opportunities he had never imagined during his childhood in the tenements. His stores were no longer simply places to buy food. They were becoming symbols of fairness and reliability to families who struggled daily with tight budgets and limited choices. Yet while many merchants would have been satisfied with steady profits and a growing reputation, Thomas was driven by something deeper. He remembered what it was like to be a child with an empty stomach and no guarantee of a warm meal. He had seen how poverty shaped a person's dignity. That memory, more than ambition or pride, pushed him to think beyond the ordinary. He wanted to offer not just goods, but consistency, trust, and comfort to those who entered his shops. This vision led him into his next major venture: tea. In the late 19th century, tea had become the quiet anchor of working-class life across Britain. It warmed cold hands, paired with meagre meals, and provided small moments of relief after long days of difficult labour. Every household depended on it. But despite its importance, the supply chain was dominated by layers of brokers and traders, each one adding cost and complicating the journey from plantation to kettle. Prices fluctuated, quality shifted unpredictably, and few merchants truly understood where their products originated or how they were handled. Thomas recognised an opportunity where others saw only routine. If he could cut through the complex chain of suppliers and handle the process himself, from cultivation to shipping, he could sell tea that was both reliable in quality and affordable for ordinary families. It was an ambition that required more than business sense. It demanded courage, travel, negotiation, and complete control over an industry that few British businessmen had ever attempted. To understand, at its roots, Determined to learn from the ground up, he travelled across oceans once again, this time heading toward the regions where tea leaves grew under monsoon clouds and tropical heat. He visited estates where long rows of plants stretched across hillsides, watched workers pluck leaves with practiced precision, and studied the stages of drying, rolling, and packing. The world of tea was intricate, demanding, and deeply tied to tradition. Every step, from the freshness of the leaves to the method of processing, determined how the final cup would taste. Thomas observed everything with the same attention he had once given to the displays in American grocery shops. He understood that mastery required patience and immersion, not shortcuts. It was during these travels that he made one of the defining decisions of his life. He purchased plantations of his own. By owning the land outright, he could manage every detail: cultivation, harvesting, processing, and shipment, without relying on unreliable intermediaries. It was a bold move, especially for someone who had grown up with nothing but borrowed coins and temporary shelter. Yet this decision gave him what every businessman desires but few achieve: absolute control over quality and cost. The tea that eventually reached Britain under his name carried more than flavour, it carried intention. Because he oversaw the entire process, he ensured that his tea was clean, properly handled, and consistent. Families could buy it with confidence, knowing they would get the same taste each time. The price was low enough for working people to afford without strain. The brand became something rare in its era, both familiar and dependable. Back home, his shops continued to multiply. Each one carried the mark of his careful planning: tidy arrangements, clear labels, warm greetings, and an atmosphere that made regular customers feel valued, not rushed. Mothers pushing tired children, labourers returning from factories, elderly couples living on modest pensions, each felt comfortable, stepping through the doors. Thomas's stores became small pockets of dignity in a world where dignity was often the first thing hardship stole from people. His innovations did not end with tea or direct sourcing. He was one of the earliest merchants to understand that publicity could transform a business if used cleverly. In a time when advertising was still a scattered and experimental practice, he embraced it with a boldness that surprised his competitors. He organised public displays, crafted memorable posters, and used humour in ways that made people smile rather than turn away. Crowds gathered at his events, drawn as much by the spectacle as by the goods being sold. His name spread not through cold announcements, but through excitement and novelty. He made shopping feel less like a struggle and more like an experience. Yet even as he accumulated wealth and influence, he carried his past with him. Those memories of hunger, cold nights, and borrowed coal never softened or faded. They remained carved into his thinking, reminding him of the families who lived exactly as he once had. Perhaps this is why he gave so freely to hospitals, charities, and local causes. He funded food programs, supported the sick, and assisted families who faced the same hardships he had known intimately. These acts were not for publicity. They were expressions of empathy from a man who understood the weight of need. Despite becoming a public figure, he never allowed pride to overshadow his personality. He greeted workers with the same warmth he showed customers, listening to their concerns and treating them with respect. Many saw him not as a distant employer but as someone who genuinely valued their work. He often said that his staff and his stores formed the closest thing he had to a family. He never married, a choice that led him to pour his energy even more deeply into his business and philanthropy. As the 20th century began, his grocery empire continued to expand across Scotland and into England. Clean storefronts, recognisable branding, and dependable prices made his chain one of the most trusted in the country. And at the centre of it all was tea, a product once dominated by complicated trade routes, now made accessible through the simple logic of direct ownership. Households across Britain began to associate his name with a reliable cup of comfort at the end of the day. By the time his hair turned white and his steps slowed, his impact was already woven into everyday life. His innovations in sourcing, presentation, and customer care had reshaped the British grocery market. He had shown that a business could grow vast while still honouring fairness and accessibility. His story revealed that ambition, when shaped by empathy rather than greed, could lift not only one man, but countless families. Even as he aged, he remained involved in the smallest details of his enterprise. He read reports, met with managers, and continued thinking of ways to improve operations. To him, success was a responsibility, not a resting place. And though he rarely spoke about his childhood, those early days continued to guide him, reminding him of the value of stable prices and honest service. His shops became landmarks, his tea became a staple, and his philosophy became a quiet lesson for every young merchant who studied his methods. The Scotland he had returned to after his American journey was no longer the same. Through decades of tireless effort, he helped transform the landscape of retail and gave working people access to quality products without humiliation or inflated cost. As he entered the final years of his life, he remained remarkably grounded. Fame did not distort him, wealth did not harden him, and success did not erase his sense of humility. He continued to give, to improve, and to uplift. The world saw him as a businessman. Those who knew him better understood he was something more, a man who had turned hardship into wisdom and used it to build something lasting. As the years unfolded and Thomas's shops spread from one neighbourhood to the next, the quiet principles he had carried from childhood began shaping an entire industry. His approach was simple on the surface: fair prices, reliable goods, and clean, welcoming stores. But underneath that simplicity lay a discipline that set him apart. He understood supply chains, like a craftsman understands his tools, and he studied the movement of goods with the same intensity he had once given to observing shopkeepers in his youth. Every decision he made reflected a deep awareness of how ordinary families lived, what they feared, and what they needed from the merchants they trusted. His success did not rise from chance. It rose from years of watching, listening, and remembering. Tea, the product that would one day define his name, became the centre of his strategic thinking. By owning plantations and managing shipping directly, he had established a system where he could safeguard quality at every step. Many businessmen envied his results, but did not have the courage to replicate his methods. They continued relying on long chains of traders and brokers, hesitant to risk their capital or reputation in unfamiliar territories. Thomas had taken that leap years earlier, and now the rewards were clear. The tea that carried his name reached Britain with a consistency that no competitor could match. Workers trusted it, families valued it, and households across the country began to treat it as a dependable part of daily life. With each ship that arrived carrying tea under his brand, his influence expanded further. His distribution network grew more efficient, his stores more polished, and his brand more recognizable. Yet despite the rapid pace of expansion, he maintained an unusual level of personal involvement. He inspected shops, reviewed supply processes, and insisted on meeting customers face to face whenever possible. People found it surprising that a man of his status could still hold conversations with ease, laugh warmly, and ask sincere questions about their struggles. His charm was not rehearsed or forced. It came from a lifetime of understanding the discomforts of poverty and the dignity that fair treatment could restore. By the time his company began reaching towns far from Glasgow, older merchants who had once dismissed him as an overly ambitious newcomer found themselves struggling to keep up. Many clung to traditional methods of pricing and supply, uncertain how to adapt to a world where customers expected clearer labels, fresher products, and stores that felt welcoming instead of intimidating. Thomas did not see their decline as triumph. Instead, he viewed it as a natural shift that came when businesses ignored the simplest truths about human needs. In his eyes, shoppers did not enter stores only to buy goods. They sought reassurance that their limited money was being spent wisely. If a shopkeeper failed to understand that, no amount of experience could save him. Throughout the expanding network of his shops, one thing remained constant: the emphasis on accessibility. He refused to place his stores solely in affluent districts. He opened branches in working-class neighbourhoods, near factories, near docks, and near places where wages were low and options were limited. His prices remained within reach, and his displays remained clear and honest. He wanted people who had grown up like he had, crowded rooms, empty plates, borrowed supplies, to feel that at least inside his stores they were valued. This philosophy became one of the quiet foundations of his business, shaping how customers spoke about him long before newspapers or advertisements celebrated his success. As his influence grew, he also became increasingly aware of the social responsibilities that came with his wealth. He funded hospitals, supported local initiatives, and contributed to relief programs during difficult winters. His donations were often given quietly, without fanfare or self-praise. Many people in need never realized that the bread they received or the beds they slept in had been paid for by a man who once endured the same hardships. He believed that helping others was not an act of generosity, but a debt he owed to the community that had supported him when he had nothing. Despite his global ambitions and the growing scope of his operations, he kept a close circle of trusted employees. He valued loyalty and understood that his workers were the face of his business. He trained them not only in sales, but in kindness. He insisted that customers be treated with genuine respect, not mechanical politeness. He reminded his staff repeatedly that the same people they serve today might return tomorrow with their families and friends, provided they felt welcomed rather than judged. Over time, this approach created a distinctive atmosphere within his shops, one that stood out in an era when many merchants still clung to sharp manners and rigid hierarchies. Even as his life became busier and more demanding, he remained grounded by the memories of his youth. He never forgot the long walks through narrow streets, the cold nights spent wishing for a thicker blanket, or the fear of watching his parents struggle for work. These memories became the invisible compass that guided him. Every time he lowered a price, improved a display, or introduced a new service, he did so with the perspective of someone who had once counted every coin. Perhaps this is why his shops never drifted into extravagance or faded into indifference. They grew with purpose, reflecting the needs of the people they served. His reputation also grew in the world of business journalism. Articles praised his marketing skills, calling him a pioneer of publicity. Writers noted how he created excitement through unexpected events and clever promotions, drawing crowds that had seldom seen such spectacle from a grocer. His campaigns were imaginative, yet practical, always rooted in the understanding that people were attracted not only to low prices but to joyful experiences. Some historians later described him as one of Britain's first truly modern businessmen, a figure who blended innovation with empathy, precision with instinct. The more his company expanded, the more he invested in improving efficiency. He sought faster shipping routes, better packaging, and cleaner storage facilities. He understood that freshness mattered, especially for tea, and he refused to let logistical challenges compromise quality. He studied transportation networks, negotiated directly with producers, and reinvested profits into strengthening the systems that kept his stores supplied. This relentless commitment to refinement ensured that his tea maintained the same taste, whether bought in Glasgow, London, or any small town in between. Yet for all his achievements, he rarely spoke about his success in grand terms. He saw his empire as the result of steady improvement rather than strokes of brilliance. In private moments, he acknowledged that his childhood struggles had shaped him more powerfully than any formal training could have. He often reflected that Hardship had taught him to observe carefully, think practically, and work without expectation of immediate reward. These lessons carried him through the most challenging phases of his business journey, guiding him long after the memories of poverty became distant. As the first decades of the 20th century unfolded, his name spread across borders. His tea reached shelves in other countries, carried by ships that had once brought it only to Britain. Travellers recognised his brand abroad and wrote letters describing the surprise of seeing it in distant markets. His company adapted to new regions and new consumers, yet the core principles he had established never shifted: affordability, quality, and consistency. He witnessed the world change rapidly around him. New technologies, new competitors, new social movements, but he remained committed to the steady, reliable model he had built from the ground up. His vision was not swayed by the trends of the moment. Instead, he stayed focused on the long-term needs of ordinary families. It was this unwavering dedication that ensured his business remained stable, even as other enterprises rose and fell. By the time he entered his later years, he had become a respected figure, not only in business circles, but in everyday conversation. People spoke of him as someone who had transformed the way they shopped, someone who had made quality goods affordable without stripping them of dignity. His life had become an example of how observation and perseverance could reshape entire industries, and though he seldom acknowledged it aloud, he knew his work had changed the landscape of British commerce in ways that would endure far beyond his lifetime. As Thomas moved into the final phases of his career, the world around him had already begun to benefit from the systems he had put into place decades earlier. His name had grown far beyond the modest shop front where he once arranged goods by hand. It had become a symbol recognised in homes where families gathered around small tables for their evening tea, in bustling markets where merchants negotiated prices, and in quiet kitchens where mothers carefully planned meals around limited budgets. His influence was visible not just in the shops that bore his name, but in the changing expectations of consumers throughout Britain. People no longer accepted dim stores, unclear pricing, or erratic quality. They wanted transparency, cleanliness, and consistency, the very principles he had championed when he first opened his doors. His company's reach extended steadily. More shops appeared in more towns, some with polished glass windows stretching across entire storefronts, others tucked between old stone buildings that had stood for centuries. Every new location carried the same feeling of order and trust that had defined his earliest ventures. Generations of shoppers began to associate his brand with a sense of stability, especially in years marked by war, recession, or uncertainty. When other businesses struggled, his often endured, supported by systems he had built long before he ever dreamed of becoming a national figure. Tea remained the heart of his success, a product so intertwined with British culture that it seemed almost destined to be the cornerstone of his empire. As global trade expanded, his plantations continued to send shipments that supplied millions of cups each day. The processes he introduced, careful sorting, precise grading, and protective packaging, ensured that customers could rely on the same comforting flavour with every purchase. Many households, even those who had never heard his full life story, considered his tea more than a drink. It was a small luxury available to anyone, a reliable companion through long work days and early mornings. Throughout these years, he continued refining the details that others overlooked. He improved storage conditions in warehouses, introduced better training for employees, and adopted cleaner, more efficient methods of transporting goods. His interest in logistics never faded. He would spend hours reviewing records, studying delivery patterns, or experimenting with new ways to reduce waste. These habits were not driven by obsession, but by a quiet understanding that success rested on 1,000 small improvements rather than a handful of grand gestures. In this way, he remained the same young boy who had once observed street vendors and learned from their mistakes. Over time, his philanthropic efforts became more pronounced. Hospitals received equipment through his donations, orphanages benefited from his contributions, and community projects gained the funding they desperately needed. He gave without seeking recognition, believing that generosity was a natural duty for someone who had risen so far from so little. Those who worked with him often noted his preference for anonymity. He did not wish for speeches, ceremonies, or exaggerated praise. He simply wanted to ensure that people who suffered the hardships he once endured might find relief, if even a small one. There was also a striking humility in his private life. He lived comfortably, of course, but never extravagantly. He did not surround himself with lavish decorations or grand estates. He preferred the comfort of simple routines, familiar surroundings, and the company of his staff, whom he viewed with deep affection. They, in turn, respected him not only as a leader, but as a man who understood the weight of real work. He never forgot their birthdays, never dismissed their concerns, and never allowed ambition to distance him from the people who kept his vision alive each day. By the early decades of the 20th century, his reputation had taken on an almost mythic quality. Newspapers wrote about him with admiration, referring to him as one of the founders of modern retail. They described his life as a testament to what careful planning and steady determination could accomplish. Yet he remained skeptical of such titles. In his view, he had simply applied common sense to problems that others had ignored. He believed that if he had any gift at all, it was the ability to look at the world through the eyes of those who struggled. As age began to slow him, he spent more time reflecting on the early chapters of his life. The long walks through crowded streets, the cold that crept through thin walls, and the hunger that shaped his earliest decisions. These memories did not haunt him. Instead, they grounded him. They reminded him of the millions of families who continued to live as his parents once had, working tirelessly for modest wages, stretching their budgets, and relying on merchants to provide honest products at fair prices. He hoped that his work had made their burdens a little lighter. When he passed away in the 1930s, newspapers across Britain reported his death with a tone of respect rarely given to businessmen. Many articles described him not simply as a commercial success, but as a figure who had changed daily life for ordinary people. They spoke of how he had redefined the grocery trade, how he had brought order and cleanliness into shops that had long ignored such standards, and how he had made quality goods accessible to those who once believed such things were out of reach. Some writers emphasized his generosity, others his charm, and still others the sheer scale of the empire he had created from almost nothing. After his death, the company he had built continued to grow. Managers who had worked closely with him carried his principles forward. They expanded into new countries, refined production techniques, and ensured that the brand retained its familiar sense of reliability. As the world entered new decades of change, wars, technological revolutions, shifting global trade, the tea bearing his name remained a presence on shelves worldwide. It crossed borders, adapted to new markets, and became part of daily life in households far from the Glasgow streets, where its founder had once searched for work as a boy. Even a century after he opened his first shop, the brand remained one of the most widely recognised in the world. People who had never heard the full story of his life could still identify the name instantly. It appeared on supermarket shelves, in advertisements, and in the cupboards of families who relied on it to begin their mornings or warm their evenings. The consistency he had championed continued to serve millions long after his own lifetime had ended. His legacy, however, was not only commercial, it was also philosophical. His life demonstrated that progress is often built on patience rather than brilliance, and that innovation can arise from quiet observation rather than sudden inspiration. He showed that businesses thrive when they respect their customers, understand their hardships, and commit to fairness even when it is not the easiest or most profitable option. These lessons resonated far beyond his shops, influencing generations of entrepreneurs who studied his methods with admiration. It is difficult to picture a transformation more dramatic than his. He had begun life in a cramped tenement where neighbours shared food to keep one another alive. He had carried parcels as a child, travelled across the ocean with almost no money, and returned home determined to create something better than what he had known. And in the years that followed, he built an empire that reshaped the habits, expectations, and experiences of consumers across continents. His journey stands as a reminder that hardship, when met with resilience and careful thought, can become the foundation of remarkable achievement. His story endures because it speaks to something universal: the idea that a single individual, armed with empathy, discipline, and an understanding of ordinary people, can influence lives far beyond his own. He proved that success does not belong solely to those born into privilege, but also to those who observe the world closely, learn from its patterns, and work tirelessly toward a vision that others cannot yet see.